Okay, so I think most of you know that I'm a big Star Wars fan, as I have made several Star Wars videos in this channel, and I just have a passionate relationship with Star Wars in general, as I have been a fan and even a hardcore fan since I was a child. And I've been playing Final Fantasy VII Remake for the past week or so, and I have played around 10 hours of the game. But first of all, I would just like to say that this video is probably going to be a bit of a rambling video. I'm not really going to edit the video as much as I usually do. I'm just going to put some Final Fantasy VII Remake gameplay under it and talk about Knights of the Old Republic alongside it, as from going on previously from that line of thought of playing the Final Fantasy VII Remake for about 10 hours and me being a huge fan of Knights of the Old Republic in general, especially KOTOR 2, and the recent rumors that we are going to get a remake or a reimagining of Knights of the Old Republic 1 and 2 especially, has really intrigued me in a sense that how would those games actually function, because as far as I remember, and I've played those games for hundreds of hours, they are very much like the original Final Fantasy games, or Final Fantasy VII in general, is that it's a turn-based combat, but of course Final Fantasy VII is the JRPG, and these are like classic Western RPGs. But when I look at Final Fantasy VII Remake, I can actually imagine Knights of the Old Republic 1 and 2 on that very same vein, or that very same engine and just game design that those games, or sorry, Final Fantasy VII was actually designed in, as I think that that game is just utterly spectacular. I feel like it's much more than a remake. It's kind of a reimagining, as of course they decided to do something else with the story itself and they fleshed it out, and it's like part 1 of part 3 or trilogy or something. But it'll be Knights of the Old Republic and the remakes coming up from probably Aspyr, who, if you don't know, made the ports for Knights of the Old Republic, The Force Unleashed for PC, KOTOR for mobile, and they even made a KOTOR 2 port without the restored content modification mod, which I was pretty pissed about, but as I've heard, you can actually install it because the modder actually allowed you to do that, which is awesome. And they have also made several ports to the PS4, like the Jedi Knight series, and they're doing Republic Commando, which is a shame that they're not getting remasters or like touch-ups, but a port is at least something, as you can't really play those games on the PlayStation 4. But what interested me about the most of that developer, and especially the KOTOR remakes, is of course how would they look. And playing Final Fantasy VII, it's like that's like the perfect blueprint for those games to work as like a modern interpretation. As if you play them, let's say on your phone, for example, they function well as like an RPG played on a phone. But if you look at the games from a modern perspective, they feel kind of archaic and a bit dated when you compare it to even like the Mass Effect series, which of course was made by BioWare as well, or even when you compare that to other newer RPGs like The Outer Worlds, which I'm going to talk about as well, or even The Witcher 3, as those RPGs feel much more modern in a sense that KOTOR actually is, even though like KOTOR's story is such a timeless thing in and of itself. But when it comes to Final Fantasy VII, they have a lot of common ground. Is that like Final Fantasy VII was of course a turn-based combat system, same with KOTOR, and they actually managed in the remake to turn that turn-based combat system on its head while giving you a kind of a real-time combat system with the turn-based combat system actually in it. And you can see it on the gameplay on the screen, that it works spectacularly well and it feels really, really great to control, and you still have a sense of control and agency over your teammates as well. And that is what you could also do in the KOTOR games, is that you had a sense of agency and you had to be the leader of your whole team and your whole party in general. But one of the more intriguing parts of just thinking about KOTOR in general is that KOTOR used, possibly due to the limitations of technology, a lot of like this classic 2000s RPG shot reverse shot structure of storytelling. Maybe you would get some wide shot when somebody's walking to a place, or a medium shot or whatever, but it wasn't really inventive in and of itself. Like, you had to fill in a lot of the blanks by your imagination, and this is why I don't necessarily feel like that could actually work. Like, a remaster of those games would work as well as, let's say, the Final Fantasy VII Remake, because what the remake actually did is that in the original Final Fantasy, it was kind of this, not TPS, but this, I don't even really know what is the expression of that. But yeah, the camera angle was kind of different. It wasn't like over the shoulder that it is here, as of course a lot of modern games use the over the shoulder camera. But with the storytelling, there are actually certain, like, every cutscene is so well designed and shot, and the story is told in such an organic and engaging way that it just leaves me kind of in awe, basically, when I play the game. Like, oh my god, this looks absolutely incredible. And I can imagine, like, Knights of the Old Republic in that aspect, as they would actually improve and make a lot of the storytelling due to the camera movements and due to this, and or with the help of the cinematics. As if you are trying to remake Knights of the Old Republic, you would have to do that, and it would add so much more to just the whole narrative and how the story is told. As I mentioned in the previous game, like, if you play Knights of the Old Republic 1 or 2 on your mobile, as that's the way I recommend you play those games, because they are much more bearable than if you play it on your PC or your Xbox. You kind of get this sense of, yeah, this works well, but in a modern setting, that wouldn't necessarily work as well, and we need those cinematics of the Final Fantasy VII Remake in order to tell that story and in order to modernize the story. But what we don't need is to lose a lot of the story due to the modernization. As what I think Final Fantasy VII does really well is that it preserves the experience of kind of the original game, in a sense that it didn't go into an open world territory, which I'm going to talk about later as well, about the level design and the just game design in general of the game, that it stays true to what the original game was, but it just modernizes it. You see, with a lot of game franchises nowadays, even Mass Effect Andromeda was considered kind of a failure because it went open world, and the Mass Effect series was never an open world game. Like, the Mass Effect series was pretty much in the vein of Knights of the Old Republic, where it was an open level design and you could explore that. And you had a hub world, which in KOTOR was the Ebon Hawk, and in Mass Effect it was the Normandy. But you didn't have that open world, and with Mass Effect it didn't really work out, even though originally in Mass Effect 1 that was what the developers wanted the game to be this kind of exploration open world stuff. But even in the first game it didn't really work out because they were just, open levels in of themselves. And now jumping on to that level design that I've talked about previously, the KOTOR games were open level designs in a sense. Like, you would go to a planet and there was a level to it. Maybe there were like several sub-levels if you went into a cave in Dantooine, for example. But it wasn't necessarily this huge open world like in a Witcher. Like, it wasn't Velen or Novigrad, or you can imagine that stuff as like the basis of it, or even just Horizon Zero Dawn's like open world, or even Assassin's Creed Valhalla's, which I've talked about, that it didn't work. And open world games, especially the open world Assassin's Creed games, don't work in the context of the franchise, as the franchise was always made to be this open level, open city design. And I feel like that if they would follow the vein of like, follow the populace, follow what sells with these KOTOR remakes, I feel like that could just basically be the end of the franchise, as it doesn't really fit with the way that KOTOR was built in. Like, as I mentioned before with the Final Fantasy VII Remake, that they wanted to keep the core experience the same. That meant that the open level design stayed the same. It kind of feels a bit funny in ways, but I feel like that it actually works because you have a much more tight experience rather than just trying to build as much stuff and trying to cram as much stuff into your product as possible, which people are not going to play because nobody's going to play a 60, 80 hour game instead of like a really focused 20 to 30 hour experience. And with KOTOR it was always like that you could just play through the whole story in like 20 or 25 hours. There was a lot of extra stuff that you could do on the levels, and a lot of extra quests, and a lot of dialogue in general that you could just spend time with your companion talking about your discoveries. But that was always the thing, that it was always open level design, and I feel like that if they were to remake the games, which they're probably doing, they should just focus on that. As if you nail that aspect, like if you nail the first KOTOR game, which there is a huge component to that which I haven't really mentioned, is that the first and the second KOTOR games actually have protagonist who is not voiced, much like in Obsidian's new RPG, The Outer Worlds. And if you haven't played that game, please check it out because it is absolutely amazing. But what The Outer Worlds does really, really well is that you can identify perfectly with the protagonist, as there is nobody voicing the character. So when you choose the answers in like a dialogue tree or a dialogue box or whatever you want to call it, it is you who are answering that because you're reading it to yourself and you select, okay, which one should I talk, or which option should I choose? And therefore you are basically voicing the protagonist, the character yourself. And what the KOTOR games actually did is that in the first game, it was a really, really important part of the whole story that the main character, the protagonist, is not voiced. And it is an integral part of the story. And if they do make a voiced protagonist, which I really hope they don't, they would have to have perfect story in order to do that, because if they do a voice protagonist, they would have to change the whole story in a sense in order to fit the narrative. For the second game, it's much more kind of lenient because you don't necessarily have to have a voiceless protagonist for the Exile. It works much better, and that's kind of one of the whole points of the KOTOR series, is that you can actually identify with the characters. But when it comes to the first game, I feel like they're using a voiceless character and just using the example of the Outer Worlds as kind of a template, other than the Final Fantasy VII remakes, like game design in general, would be the best option for the developers to choose. And if they nail the first game, which I think is easily the hardest, or the harder out of the two games, then they basically nail the second one as well, because in the second one there is just barely anything kind of worth adding or worth mentioning, in a sense that, you know, there is a new crafting system basically, but that's kind of it. The morality system is a bit different with the companions, but it's kind of the same thing. And if they nail the first game, then the second one is like a given. But when I look at the Final Fantasy VII Remake, like, I can imagine that game design and that combat system and just the whole game, playing that in like 2024, 2025 even, when the last part of the trilogy comes out. And I would say the same thing for the KOTOR games. Like, if they nail that formula with the voiceless protagonist from the Outer Worlds and the Final Fantasy VII Remake, like, combined into one, that would be a perfect reimagining of Knights of the Old Republic. Then I feel like that this franchise could be one of the most long-lived and profitable franchises, not just within the Star Wars realm of gaming, but within all of gaming itself, as fans are so in love with this whole era of the Knights of the Old Republic that BioWare and Obsidian created back in the day. And you can even like check out SWTOR over, because they have continued a lot of the story threads in there, and there's a lot of story content here as well. But if they nail that, there's absolutely no chance in hell that they're not going to make a huge franchise out of it for the next like 10 to 20 years, and we're going to see a lot of these KOTOR games if they nail the formula. If they don't, and they mess it up a bit, and they don't respect the IP and mostly the first game, then this could be a huge bummer. But since Aspyr is working on the IP and they're very, very familiar with the story of the first and the second game, with a lot of Star Wars, doing a lot of Star Wars sports in general, and how or what fans actually want from Star Wars games, they of course see the sales numbers as well. I can see them being really, really successful with that whole thing. But that is all I had for today. Please let me know all of your thoughts in the comments down below regarding the Knights of the Old Republic remake, or just Final Fantasy VII in general, or even just the Outer Worlds. And thank you so much for watching today's video. Please leave a like if you have enjoyed this. And I hope you enjoyed this different type of video for today. And subscribe for more content like this one. And I will see you in the next one. And until then, remember to keep it insightful.